Thank you. First, I want to thank Emma Franklin for organizing this event to discuss the necessity of and the way in which we can post-humanize sustainability. As promised in my abstract, I will first go through a few points pertaining to contemporary sustainability discourse. I will then propose pathways for replacing the anthropocentric worldview that underlies that discourse. And these pathways will take us through post-humanist material feminist proposals and take us to extinction, which is, I hope, our common future. Now, before you think I embrace a doom and gloom perspective on the state of things, welcoming extinction, do not worry, my extinction events will be joyful. So please bear with me. Okay. So what do we have in mind when we speak about sustainability? Many international documents, development projects, and governments at all levels rely on a definition of sustainability that directly points to human environmental management, such as to secure access to natural resources for future generations of humans. This is a well-known definition. This concept of sustainability emerged in the influential environmentalist article, A Blueprint for Survival from 1974. Now, it may be a blueprint, but it is one tainted green. Green and blue, green for hope, maybe. Green is supposed to be the color symbolizing hope. Green for the lush nature, nature that thrives, and blue for clean skies or clean waters. Most imagery that is used in sustainability discourse is in those hues. Just do a quick Google search for sustainability image, Google search for images, and your screen will be filled with those hues. As for environmental philosophy, it typically approaches the question of sustainability from the point of view of an ethical reflection on our individual and collective responsibility toward the earth and its various elements. But those theories rest on a humanist and neoliberal understanding of the ethical agent and conceive of the human as one who has a duty of care and stewardship, and one who has the technological and scientific knowledge to use resources in a sustainable manner to ensure its own survival. An approach to sustainability from the point of view of environmental ethics is concerned with future generations and their accessibility to natural resources or a natural environment in which they can flourish and enjoy a healthy life. The key phrases and key terms that are used in sustainability discourse are interesting to ponder for a few minutes. As a colleague was pointing out recently, the original etymological sense of sustainability, from the Latin sustenere, to hold up, or also to bear or to endure, that original sense has become perverted to mean sustainable development, which has an implication that development is desirable or maybe inevitable. So the emphasis shifts from sustainable to development. The phrase ecosystem services is a phrase that captures all the benefits humans can derive from healthy ecosystems. The more recent term that has come to often replace it, nature's contributions to people, still carries the same emphasis and in some ways is more honest about its understanding of the relationship between nature and humans. Nature is there to serve and support humans. Now, the concept of planetary boundaries is one that presents a set of 9 planetary boundaries within which humanity can continue to develop and thrive for generations to come. The idea behind it is that we can identify the most important elements of planetary life and successfully measure our consumption and impact. Likewise, the assumption is that we can put in place policies and measures that will prevent us from exceeding said boundaries. Future generations, as I've said a few times, in sustainability discourse, these are clearly future generations of humans. Those are the generations, the future generations we're concerned with. Nature-based solutions is another term that we encounter often, and it's a rather newcomer phrase. In 2016, IUCN's members adopted a resolution which for the first time defined the use of nature for simultaneous benefits to biodiversity and societal well-being. According to the resolution, nature-based solutions are, and I'm quoting here, actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Now, while this seems like an improvement in conceiving of things, I would claim that it is still anthropocentric in its approach, as it speaks of human management and is concerned with societal challenges. The concern for nature exists insofar as it underlies a societal problem and insofar as biodiversity benefits humans. Otherwise, it is not of concern. The discourse on sustainability, its buzzwords and key phrases, are all permeated by a humanist anthropocentric worldview, which has been the driver of the manifold crises in which we live, including the environmental crisis. A humanist worldview considers the human to be exceptional, separate from other beings, and from nature. Humanism considers the human to be in a position of dominance. The human is at the top of various versions of the great chain of beings, or of the biotic pyramid, if you prefer. And this position of being at the top grants the human permission to engage in exploitative and oppressive practices, an extractive mentality. The human considers non-human beings to be resources for its sustenance. There is thus a disconnect that is introduced between the human and the more than human. Such view, the humanist view, does not consider the human as interconnected. The humanist worldview is also infused with techno-optimism. Since the human is a rational being with great inventivity, great capacity, mental capacities, we will always ultimately find a techno-scientific solution to the problems we are faced with. Often, the thinking goes that all we need really is a little bit more work, a little bit more research, more creativity to devise the solution to the problems we encounter and often cause ourselves. For example, faced with an increase in demand for animal protein, the production of which puts a lot of stress on the environment, as we know, not to mention the fact that it increases the likelihood of zoonotic diseases with which we've become way too familiar. Given this increase in demand, researchers work on techno-scientific solutions like increased efficiency in factory farming or the creation of lab meat, instead of focusing on cultural normative changes in relations between humans and the non-humans they consume, and how humans value the life of more than human beings. Instead of examining our ways of life and questioning our relations, we seek to maintain them for ourselves and for future generations. A post-humanist environmental philosophy requires that we rethink sustainability and its related concepts and that we think sustainability in non-anthropocentric terms. This task is urgent in light of the global impact the human and its anthropocentric humanist worldview has had in generating the Anthropocene, even if there is, as we know, no going back to a pre-Anthropocenic world. Okay, so a little bit about posthumanism. Posthumanism, and I'm trying to emphasize a strong hyphen here between post and humanism. Posthumanism, so literally an after humanism, and material feminism, which is a subfield that is concerned with renewing attention to materiality. So posthumanism and material feminism propose to think things differently. Posthumanist material feminism rejects human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism and repositions the human among other beings. It posits that we need to rethink the human and dismiss the humanist conception of the human, so a post-humanism. It also points to a long history of thinking through dualisms and privileging the mind over the body, the human over the non-human, the human over nature. As a feminist perspective, it points to the numerous inequities and power hierarchies that are enabled by a humanist perspective. Material feminists insist the human of humanism, the one who enjoys the position of privilege and dominance, is really a white, cis, heterosexual, middle to upper class, able-bodied man. And this this position has a number of implications. First, the historical humanist focus on the mind, on consciousness, has entailed a disregard for materiality. Posthumanist material feminists focus our attention on materiality. It initiates a shift. Second, dualistic thinking has traditionally hidden the manifold entanglements of which we are. We need to rediscover those and understand ourselves as entangled, materially and subjectively. Third, posthumanist material feminism is a mode of system thinking, but one in which humility is key. There is a great level of uncertainty and indeterminacy in the systems of which we are parts, and we may never fully understand them or the impact of our actions and policies within them. And fourth, post-anthropocentrism eliminates oppressive and exploitative structures of power. Rosie Berdotti speaks of a Zoe egalitarianism, the valuing of all expressions of life and the recognition that life does things. Humility and Zoe egalitarianism lead us to a more careful approach, an approach full of care, one which considers the good and flourishing of all species, a decentering of the human. So when we talk about sustainability, we need to ask which sustainability and for whom. And from the point of view of posthumanism, the answer to this needs to consider the more than human equally. It is unacceptable that human thriving should come at the cost of that of other species, which it has so far done. Just as much as thinking of future generations only in terms of humans is problematic. The well-being and thriving of future generations ought to be of future generations of more than humans as well. This photograph on this slide was taken at a hotel where I stayed in Amsterdam in 2016. The whole hotel had a chocolate theme with fun, cute quotes like this on their restaurant placemats, elevator doors, walls. And this one was in the first floor public washroom. Save the Earth. It's the only planet with chocolate. Well, at first sight, this makes one smile, or at least it worked with me. But then one has to wonder who besides humans would care for chocolate so much as to make it their motivation to save the Earth. Not to mention that chocolate is toxic to non-human animals. In any case, the questions that are raised, if we are going to expand the notion of future generations, are: what counts as a life? Can we recognize a life, a thriving life? And can we value it? Jane Bennett speaks of matter as vibrant. She says, I quote, "I believe it is wrong to deny vitality to non-human bodies, forces, and forms. I believe that encounters with lively matter can chasten my fantasies of human mastery, highlight the common materiality of all that is, expose a wider distribution of agency, and reshape the self and its interests." Bennett's explicit goals are ethical and political. She wishes us to be attentive to matter and its power, and thinks that, quote again, "it can inspire a greater sense of the extent to which all bodies are kin, in the sense of inextricably enmeshed in a dense network of relations." And you have that part of the quote on the slide, "in a knotted world of vibrant matter, to harm one section of the web may very well be to harm oneself. Such an enlightened or expanded notion of self-interest is good for humans." So this idea that all bodies are kin and that matter has agency is very prominent in material feminist theory. I also like how Diana Cole puts it in terms of agentic capacity. To speak of agentic capacity moves us away from a subject-object dichotomy where an identifiable and delimited subject can be identified as an agent. To say that all matter and material beings have agentic capacity allows for capturing the way in which we are done and undone by our material entanglements, and serves to undermine the fantasy of human mastery and exception. As Samantha Frost puts it in her book, Biocultural Creatures, and you have the quote there, "there are many more agents afoot in the world than human exceptionalism has allowed." Both a forest fire or a microbe have agentic capacity, and sometimes the extent of their agency may far surpass that of the human. And we have learned that the hard way through the current pandemic. We need a new theory of the human, according to Frost, one that, she says, quote, "does not succumb to the conceits of old," by which she means the human exceptionalism of humanism, but also does not conceptually dissolve humans as identifiable agents and thereby absolve them of the crises that mark the Anthropocene. Stacey Alaimo and Nancy Tuana share the material feminist approach. Alaimo emphasizes that we are transcorporeal beings. She says, quote, "a recognition of transcorporeality entails a rather disconcerting sense of being immersed within incalculable, interconnected material agencies that erode even our most sophisticated modes of understanding," end quote. She suggests, and that's my very favorite quote from Alaimo, you have it on the slide, that the human is always the very stuff of the messy, contingent, emergent mix of the material world. She embraces Nancy Tuana's view of viscous porosity, the view that is connected to interactionism, which sees the world as composed of complex phenomena in dynamic relationality. And she insists that our bodies have permeable boundaries like the skin, mucous surfaces, orifices, and that all makes us porous beings that are transpierced by the materiality surrounding us. Alaimo's more recent work pushes this line of thinking. She talks of the exposed subject, you have this quote there, which is always already penetrated by substances and forces that can never be properly accounted for. And as she points out, the Anthropocene suggests that agency must be rethought in terms of interconnected entanglements rather than as a unilateral authoring of actions. She quotes Jessie Lemon and Sarah Nelson, who claim that, quote, "the Anthropocene therefore simultaneously expands and radically undermines conventional notions of agency and intentionality." What is needed then is for us to think the human being as material, as subject to the agencies of the compromised, entangled world. We need to embrace, quote again, ALAIMO, an environmental posthumanism, insisting that what we are as bodies and minds is inextricably interlinked with the circulating substances, materialities, and forces, end quote. This requires a radical change in how we conceive of ourselves, our world, and our relations to and within it. And to quote ALAIMO again, one last time, thinking, and you have this on the slide, thinking as the stuff of the world entails thinking in places that are simultaneously the material of the self and the vast networks of material worlds. Thinking of the porous and exposed beings we are, Claire Colebrook says, the quote is up there, we are at once thrown into a situation of urgent interconnectedness, aware that the smallest events contribute to global mutations at the same time as we come up against a complex multiplicity of diverging forces and timelines that exceed any manageable point of view. And this view aligns with my concept of transjectivity, which I just want to mention very briefly. I propose that the human being and any living being is a transjective being, that is transsubjective and transsubjective. We are assemblages of experiences, consciousness, materiality. We are permeated by the world and thereby rendered vulnerable. And that is the concept I'm working on right now, the concept of post-human vulnerability. As transjective beings, we are permeated by and permeate the world. We are thereby vulnerable, but this post-human vulnerability is not negative. It is also generative. It is because we are open to the world and to other beings that we can thrive. Now, Colebrook speaks of an ethics of extinction, which would also be a counter-ethics. She explains that such a counter-ethics would be rooted in the looming extinction we are facing in the present, without assuming the ethos of the present, which means to abandon a humanist type of ethics that privileges the human and instead adopt a counter-ethics in which, quote, one would consider what is worthy of concern or survival, what of the human, the multitude, or the living would enable an ethos that was not the ethos of the present. So what Colebrook is pointing to here is the idea that along with rethinking ourselves, we need to rethink our notion of sustainability. A post-humanist environmental philosophy requires that we rethink such notions as sustainability in non-anthropocentric terms. This task is urgent in light of the global impact the human and its anthropocentric humanist worldview has had in generating the Anthropocene. As transjective beings, we are in a position to understand ourselves and other beings as radically entangled, even though we may never be in a position to understand fully how agentic capacity unfolds, who exercises it, and in what way. We need to remain humble with regards to our capacity to grasp the world in which we find ourselves. But thinking materiality in the way material feminists propose is a good way to recognize the kind of being we and more than humans are, and that we are as entangled. The fact that we can understand, albeit in this limited way, invests us with a responsibility that takes the form of a response ability. We are the beings who can understand and, based on this understanding, respond. Therefore, we have a duty to respond, and the first response ought to be to change our worldview. If we rethink sustainability, as we should, and expand it to include the well-being and thriving of the future generations of all species, which would amount to a post-humanist sustainability, one unpalatable question arises. Should the species that is the most damaging to the planet and its inhabitants, itself included, go extinct so that other species may thrive? If we are indeed going to recognize that all life is transjective and therefore radically entangled, and if we embrace the value of all life and create conditions for all life to flourish, that may indeed entail the necessity for our species to go extinct. It is the key to, the question is it the key to genuine sustainability? But when we think of extinction, we need to think beyond the death of the last individuals of a species. When Martha the passenger pigeon passed in 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo, it was thought that this was the moment of extinction for that species. However, as Tom Van Doren argues, the species had been long dead. If we think of species as a way of life of individuals, of that species, and all the relations it enters into, we can say that the species was extinct well before 1914. The same is true of all species for which a few individuals are kept in zoos or natural preservation sites. Their way of life has been long gone. Van Doren explains that extinction is not a specific moment. That is the moment the last individual dies, but rather it is a long, dull unfolding. And the same applies to the human. Living as humanist humans and cutting ourselves from our relations to the more than human, and having caused the disappearance of many non-human animal and plant species, our way of life as entangled being has long been extinct. The humanist human is a perversion of the human as transjective. That humanist human must now become extinct, and in fact is already becoming extinct. We must seize this moment of opportunity, and we must become post-humanist humans. This means that the post-humanist future laying ahead is one of joyful extinction. It is the joyful dismissal of a way of life based on a damaging worldview, the rejection of a damaging view of ourselves and of more than humans, and a radical misunderstanding of what ties us together. The post-humanist future is in the plural when we embrace a notion of post-humanist sustainability that fosters the thriving of all species, that recognizes our relations and seeks to maintain and nourish them. Embracing a post-humanist perspective opens up opportunities for all life and thereby opens up futures. Extinction will be joyful if we embrace the opportunities before us and open up these futures. Thank you.